The hammers rang out across the Texas plains in perfect rhythm, but these weren't American hands wielding them. German prisoners of war sang hymns in their native tongue as they carefully restored each wooden beam of the abandoned chapel, their voices carrying hope where once only despair had lived. Colonel William Harrington stood watching from his office window, knowing that his decision to give enemy soldiers tools and lumber would either be remembered as brilliant compassion or career-ending foolishness. What happened next would change not just the prisoners, but everyone who witnessed this extraordinary act of faith in humanity's better angels. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The West Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Hearn that sweltering morning in July 1945, its rays turning the barbed wire into glittering ribbons of heat. Behind those fences, nearly 4,000 German prisoners of war moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of men who had learned that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. The war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier, yet here they remained, caught in the limbo between defeat and an uncertain future. Erich Bauer pressed his face against the wire mesh of the exercise yard, his weathered hands gripping the metal as he gazed toward the small structure that had captured his attention for weeks. The chapel sat approximately 200 yards beyond the camp's perimeter, its white paint peeling like dead skin, its roof sagging under the weight of neglect in Texas storms. Once, it had served the small farming community that existed before the government claimed this land for the prisoner of war camp. Now it stood as a monument to abandonment, its broken windows staring blindly across the prairie like the hollow eyes of a skull. Still dreaming about that old church, Erich? The voice belonged to Klaus Zimmermann, a former Luftwaffe pilot whose left arm hung useless from a bombing run over London 2 years prior. Klaus approached with the careful gait of a man who had learned to balance his world despite its fundamental asymmetry. Erich didn't turn from the fence. At 32, he had been an architect in Munich before the war swept him into its machinery of destruction. His mind, trained to see possibilities in empty spaces, couldn't help but envision what the chapel could become with proper care. "I'm not dreaming," he said quietly, his English heavily accented but clear. "I'm planning." Klaus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Planning what? To sprout wings and fly over this fence? To convince the Americans that German prisoners should be allowed to wander the countryside restoring churches? "Maybe," Erich replied, and this time he did turn to face his friend. Klaus saw something in Erich's eyes that hadn't been there since their capture near the Rhine 6 months earlier, something that looked dangerously like hope. The idea had been growing in Erich's mind for weeks, fed by the profound emptiness that had settled into his soul after years of warfare. He had lost his faith somewhere between the bombed cathedrals of France and the frozen wasteland of the Russian front, but the sight of that broken chapel stirred something deep within him that he had thought permanently buried. Perhaps it was the architect in him, unable to see structural decay without imagining restoration. Perhaps it was something deeper, a need to create rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. That evening, as the prisoners gathered in the mess hall for their dinner of thin soup and dark bread, Erich shared his idea with a small group of men who had become his closest companions in captivity. Besides Klaus, there was Johann Weber, a carpenter from Bavaria, whose massive hands seemed too gentle for the violence they had once been forced to commit. Heinrich Müller, a stonemason from the Rhineland, sat quietly listening, his gray eyes thoughtful. Father Andreas Richter, who had served as both chaplain and soldier in the Wehrmacht, nodded slowly as Erich spoke. "You want to ask the Americans if we can leave the camp to restore a church?" Johann's voice carried the skepticism of a practical man. "They'll think we're planning an escape, not leave the camp," Erich corrected, leaning forward across the rough wooden table. "Ask them to move the work detail boundary, to let us work on the chapel as part of our daily labor. We're already clearing brush and maintaining the campgrounds. This would be no different. Except we'd be creating something beautiful instead of just maintaining what exists." End quote. Father Richter spoke for the first time, his voice soft but carrying the weight of authority that came from years of providing comfort to dying men. "The chapel, it calls to you, doesn't it, Erich? I've seen you watching it during prayer time. I haven't prayed in 2 years, Father. I didn't say you were praying, the older man replied with a knowing smile. I said you were watching during prayer time. Sometimes that's where prayer begins, with simply seeing what needs to be restored. The group fell silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. They had all been changed by the war in ways that would take years to understand, if understanding ever came at all. For most, faith had been one of the first casualties, abandoned in the mud of Stalingrad or the rubble of Berlin. Yet something about Erich's proposal touched a chord in each of them, awakening a desire they had thought dead. Who would we ask? Heinrich finally broke the silence. The guards? Sergeant Patterson seems reasonable enough. Klaus shook his head. This kind of request, it needs to go to the top, to Colonel Harrington himself. The mention of the camp commander's name brought another wave of silence. Colonel William Harrington was respected among the prisoners, known for his fair treatment and adherence to the Geneva Convention, but he was still the man who held their lives in his hands. He was the enemy, even if he was a benevolent one. Then that's what we'll do, Erich said, with a finality that surprised even himself. We'll request an audience with Colonel Harrington and present our proposal. Over the following days, Erich threw himself into the planning with the same methodical precision he had once applied to designing buildings in Munich. He sketched the chapel from memory, noting every detail he could observe from the camp's perimeter. He calculated the materials that would be needed, the time required for various repairs, the number of men who could work efficiently on different aspects of the project. Heinrich provided insights into the stone foundation work, while Johann offered expertise on the wooden structure, and Klaus, despite his cynicism, found himself contributing ideas about the electrical DAS systems that would need attention. Father Richter became an unexpected ally, not just in planning but in providing historical context. Through conversations with some of the longer-serving American guards, he learned that the chapel had been built in 1928 by German immigrants who had settled in the area after the First World War. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that German prisoners of war were now hoping to restore a structure built by their countrymen who had sought peace in America after the last great conflict. The formal request took Erich 3 days to write, with input and corrections from the others. He wrote it in his careful, precise English, knowing that every word would be scrutinized not just for meaning, but for intent. The document outlined the proposal clearly. A work detail of 12 German prisoners would be permitted to restore the abandoned chapel under guard supervision. The project would serve multiple purposes, including maintaining prisoner morale, providing valuable work experience, and potentially creating a space that could serve both the camp and the local community once the prisoners were eventually repatriated. Sergeant James Patterson, a career soldier from Oklahoma, who had earned the respect of both his superiors and the German prisoners through his straightforward approach to camp management, agreed to deliver the request to Colonel Harrington. Patterson had served in the Pacific Theater before being assigned to Camp Hearn, and he understood the psychological toll that extended captivity could take on men, regardless of which uniform they had worn. "I'll get this to the colonel," Patterson told Erich as he accepted the carefully folded document. "But I've got to tell you, this is about the strangest request I've ever seen from a prisoner. You sure you're not planning something besides carpentry?" Erich met the sergeant's eyes directly. "I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman that this request is exactly what it appears to be. We want to build something, Sergeant Patterson. For 2 years, all we've done is destroy. I think maybe it's time to create something instead." Patterson nodded slowly. There was something in the German's voice that convinced him of the sincerity behind the unusual request. "I'll make sure he reads it personally." Colonel William Harrington was reviewing supply reports in his office when Sergeant Patterson knocked on his door that Thursday afternoon. The colonel was 43 years old, a West Point graduate who had commanded men in the North African campaign before being assigned to oversee the prisoner of war operations in Texas. He was a man who believed in discipline and order, but also in the fundamental dignity of all soldiers, regardless of the flag under which they had served. "Come in, Sergeant," Harrington called out, not looking up from his paperwork. Patterson entered and stood at attention. "Sir, I have an unusual request from one of the German prisoners. I think you should read this personally." Harrington looked up, his gray eyes curious. In 18 months of running Camp Hearn, he had received countless requests from the prisoners, mostly routine matters involving mail, medical care, or work assignments. Unusual how? They want to restore the old chapel outside the camp perimeter, sir, as a work detail. The colonel set down his pen and extended his hand for the document. He read it slowly, his expression neutral, but his mind racing. The request was well-written, thoughtful, and completely unexpected. He had noticed the abandoned chapel during his initial tour of the facility, but had never given it much consideration. Now, reading Erich Bauer's carefully constructed proposal, he found himself seeing it through the eyes of men who had spent months staring at it through barbed wire. "What do you know about this Bauer?" Harrington asked. "He's been here since January, sir. Former Wehrmacht officer, architect by training, clean disciplinary record, speaks excellent English. The other prisoners respect him. He's organized a few educational lectures on engineering topics during their recreation time." Harrington leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered the implications. The request was unprecedented, but it wasn't unreasonable. The prisoners were already working on various projects around the camp, from food service to maintenance. Extending the work area to include the chapel wouldn't present any significant security risks, especially with proper guard supervision. But there were other considerations. How would his superiors react to German prisoners of war restoring a church? How would the local community respond? And perhaps most importantly, what were the real motivations behind this request? "Arrange a meeting," Harrington decided. "I want to speak with Bauer personally." The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning in Colonel Harrington's office. Erich was escorted by 2 guards through parts of the camp he had never seen, past administrative buildings and storage facilities that reminded him how much larger and more complex Camp Hearn was than what the prisoners typically experienced in their daily routines. Colonel Harrington's office was spartanly decorated, dominated by a large map of Texas and several photographs of military units. Behind the desk, the American flag stood alongside framed commendations and citations. Erich stood at attention until the colonel gestured for him to sit in the chair across from the desk. "At ease, Bauer," Harrington said, studying the German officer carefully. "I've read your proposal. It's well thought out, but I have questions." "Of course, sir. First, why this chapel? Why this project?" Erich had prepared for this question, but sitting across from the American commander, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from his prepared remarks. "Colonel, for 2 years I was part of an army that destroyed things. Beautiful things, churches, museums, homes where families had lived for generations. I was an architect before the war, sir. I built things, created spaces where people could live and work and worship. The war took that away from me, turned my skills toward destruction instead of creation." End quote. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I look at that chapel, I see something that can be saved, something that can be made beautiful again. Maybe it's selfish, but I need to build something, sir. I need to create instead of destroy." Harrington nodded slowly. The answer had a ring of truth that resonated with his own experiences. "What about security concerns? You're asking me to allow enemy soldiers to work outside the camp perimeter with tools that could be used as weapons?" "Yes, sir. You would be taking a risk. But you would be taking a risk on men who are already working with tools inside the camp every day. Hammers, saws, shovels. We use them all in our current work details. And we would be working under guard supervision, just as we do now." End quote. "Some people would say I'm crazy to even consider this. Some people said you were crazy to allow us to organize educational lectures, or to let us grow gardens, or to permit religious services," Erich replied. "But those things have made us better prisoners, haven't they? Less trouble, more productive, better morale." The colonel leaned forward, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the desk. "Tell me about the other men you want to include in this project." Erich described each of his proposed team members, their backgrounds, their skills, their temperaments. He spoke of Klaus's practical engineering knowledge despite his injury, of Johann's masterful carpentry skills, of Heinrich's expertise with stonework, of Father Richter's ability to provide spiritual guidance and maintain group cohesion. "These are good men, Colonel," Erich concluded. "Men who made mistakes, perhaps, or who were caught up in something larger than themselves, but good men nonetheless. This project would give them something to believe in again. Harrington was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request against his responsibilities as camp commander. Finally, he spoke. "I'm going to approve your request, Bauer, but with conditions." Erich felt his heart leap, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. First, this is a probationary approval. Any problems, any security concerns, any disciplinary issues with your team, and the project stops immediately. Second, you'll work under close guard supervision at all times. Third, all tools will be checked out each morning and checked in each evening. Fourth, you'll provide daily progress reports to Sergeant Patterson. And fifth, the finished chapel will be available for use by both American personnel and German prisoners, should either group desire to hold religious services there." End quote. "Understood completely, sir. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Harrington said with a slight smile. "I still have to figure out how to explain this to my superiors. But Bauer, I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I've gone soft on German prisoners. I'm doing this because I think it might accomplish something positive for everyone involved. Don't make me regret this decision." "You won't, sir. I give you my word." The news of the approved chapel project spread through Camp Hearn like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from excitement to bewilderment to outright skepticism. Many of the German prisoners couldn't believe that the Americans would actually allow such a thing, while some of the American guards questioned the wisdom of giving enemy soldiers access to tools and unsupervised work areas outside the camp proper. Sergeant Patterson found himself fielding questions from both sides. The American personnel wanted to know about security protocols and oversight procedures, while the German prisoners peppered him with inquiries about the selection process for the work detail and the scope of the WWII restoration project. "How the hell did you convince the old man to go along with this?" Corporal Mike Rodriguez asked Patterson during their evening briefing. Rodriguez was responsible for work detail security and would be personally overseeing the chapel project. "I didn't convince him of anything," Patterson replied. "Bauer made his own case. But I'll tell you what, Mike, I've been watching these prisoners for over a year now, and I've never seen anything generate this kind of positive response. Half of them are volunteering for the work detail, even the ones who've never shown interest in anything but complaining about the food. Indeed, the response from the German prisoners exceeded even Erich's expectations. Men who had maintained sullen silence for months were suddenly approaching him with offers to help, suggestions for improvements, and stories about their own pre-war experiences with construction and craftsmanship. Former engineers described techniques for addressing the chapel's structural problems, while men who had worked in trades before the war offered specialized knowledge about everything from plumbing to electrical work to, quote, decorative finishing. The selection process proved more difficult than Erich had anticipated. Colonel Harrington had approved a 12-man work detail, but more than 40 prisoners had volunteered. Erich found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between eager men who desperately wanted to be part of something meaningful and constructive. In the end, he based his selections on a combination of technical skills, English language ability, and disciplinary records. Besides the original 5 planners, the team included Kurt Wagner, a former electrician from Hamburg, Franz Dietrich, a plumber from Stuttgart Otto Brennan, a painter and decorator from Vienna Ludwig Haas, a roofer from Cologne Peter Newman, a glazier who could handle the window repairs, and Werner Koch, a general laborer whose enthusiasm made up for his lack of specialized skills. The first day of work began at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in early August. The 12 German prisoners were escorted by 4 American guards, led by Corporal Rodriguez, on the short walk from Camp Hearn to the chapel. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching Texas day, but there was an energy among the work party that had been absent from the camp for months. As they approached the chapel, Erich felt his breath catch in his throat. Seeing the structure up close for the first time revealed both the extent of the damage and the beauty of the original construction. The building was larger than it had appeared from the camp, approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a peaked roof and a small bell tower that listed slightly to the south. The foundation stones were solid limestone, quarried locally, and fitted with the skill of craftsmen who had taken pride in their work. But the years of neglect had taken their toll. Several roof boards had warped and split, allowing rain to damage the interior. The windows were mostly broken, their frames rotted and sagging. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the white paint had peeled away to reveal weathered gray wood underneath. "Jesus," Corporal Rodriguez muttered, surveying the damage. "This is going to take a lot more than a few weeks." Erich walked slowly around the perimeter, his trained eye cataloging problems and possibilities. The structure was sound, the foundation solid, the basic framework intact. With proper materials and careful work, the chapel could indeed be restored to something approaching its original condition. "We'll need lumber," he told Rodriguez. "Quite a bit, actually. And roofing materials, window glass, paint, hardware for the doors and windows." "That's not my department," Rodriguez replied. "You'll need to submit a materials list through proper channels. But I can tell you right now, the Army's not going to spring for premium materials on this project." "We don't need premium materials," Johann interjected, running his hands along one of the damaged window frames. "Just serviceable lumber and basic supplies. We can make do with less than perfect materials if we have to." Over the following days, the work party established routines and divided responsibilities. Erich served as the project foreman, coordinating the various specialties and ensuring that work proceeded in logical sequence. Heinrich and Ludwig focused on the foundation and structural repairs, while Franz investigated the plumbing system that had once supplied water to a small vestry behind the main chapel space. Kurt began tracing the electrical systems, most of which would need complete replacement. Johann took charge of the carpentry work, assisted by Werner and guided by his own meticulous standards. Otto prepared surfaces for eventual painting, carefully scraping away layers of old paint and primer to reveal the wood underneath. Peter measured windows and began planning the glazing work that would be required once new frames were constructed. Father Richter moved among the workers like a gentle overseer, offering encouragement, settling minor disputes, and gradually transforming what could have been just another work detail into something that resembled a community of craftsmen united by common purpose. The American guards initially maintained their distance, watching carefully for any signs of trouble or attempts at escape. But as the days passed and the Germans threw themselves into the work with obvious dedication, the atmosphere began to relax. Corporal Rodriguez found himself drawn into technical discussions about construction methods, while the other guards began offering their own observations and suggestions. "You know," Private Jimmy Walker mentioned to Rodriguez one afternoon as they watched Johann carefully fitting a new window frame, "my dad was a carpenter before the war. That German fellow knows what he's doing." The breakthrough moment came during the second week of work, when a sudden afternoon thunderstorm caught the work party outside the chapel. Instead of returning immediately to camp, the Germans and their guards took shelter together inside the partially restored building, waiting for the storm to pass. As rain drummed on the patched roof and occasional drops found their way through gaps in the repair work, Father Richter began to sing, his voice low and melodious. The hymn was in German, but the melody was familiar to several of the American guards who had grown up in churches across the rural South and Midwest. One by one, other German voices joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to transform the rough interior of the work-in-progress chapel into something approaching a sacred space. When the hymn ended, the silence that followed was comfortable rather than tense, a shared moment of peace that transcended the barriers of nationality and conflict. "That was beautiful," Private Walker said quietly, and Father Richter smiled and nodded his thanks. From that day forward, singing became a regular part of the work routine. As the Germans labored on various tasks, hymns and traditional psalms provided rhythm and companionship. Some were religious, others were folk songs that spoke of home and family and better times. Occasionally, one of the American guards would recognize a melody and hum along, creating moments of unexpected connection. Word of the chapel project began to spread beyond Camp Hearn. Local farmers and townspeople drove out of their way to observe the unusual sight of German prisoners of war, carefully restoring the small church that had been abandoned since the early days of the war. Some reactions were hostile, residents questioning the wisdom of allowing enemy soldiers to work unsupervised with tools and materials. But others were intrigued by the obvious care and craftsmanship being applied to the restoration. Mrs. Helen Crawford, whose late husband had been one of the original builders of the chapel in 1928, made a special trip to observe the work during the third week of August. She was 74 years old, a widow who had lost 2 sons in the European theater, and everyone expected her reaction to be negative. Instead, she stood silently for nearly an hour, watching as Heinrich carefully repointed the limestone foundation and Johann fitted new boards to replace damaged sections of the exterior walls. When Erich finally approached her, expecting criticism or demands that the project be stopped, she surprised him with tears in her eyes. "My husband would have been proud to see this," she said simply. "He always said a church should be cared for by people who understand what it means to need God's grace." Mrs. Crawford began returning regularly, sometimes bringing lemonade for the workers on particularly hot days, sometimes just sitting in her car and watching the progress. Her acceptance of the project helped shift local opinion, and gradually other community members began viewing the German on. Prisoners not as enemies engaged in suspicious activities, but as craftsmen working to restore something beautiful and meaningful. The materials situation proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The Army was willing to provide basic lumber and hardware, but many of the specialized items needed for proper restoration, particularly for the windows and interior finishing work, were either unavailable or cost prohibitive. It was Johann who suggested a solution that surprised everyone. "What if we made some of what we need?" he asked during one of the evening planning sessions back at the camp. "I know woodworking. Heinrich knows stonework. Otto has experience with decorative painting. We could create custom pieces instead of trying to find manufactured replacements." The suggestion appealed to Erich's architectural sensibilities and to the craftsman's pride that had been awakening in all the workers. Instead of simply repairing the chapel, they could improve it, adding touches of artistry and craftsmanship that would make it more beautiful than it had ever been. Colonel Harrington approved the expanded scope of the project after reviewing detailed plans and cost estimates. The additional time and creative work would keep the prisoners occupied and productive for several additional months, which aligned with his broader goals for camp morale and administration. As summer faded into autumn, the chapel began to take on a beauty that exceeded everyone's expectations. Johann crafted new pews from salvaged lumber, carving simple but elegant decorative elements into the end pieces. Heinrich created a small altar from local limestone, polishing the surface to a smooth luster that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, filtering through the restored windows. Peter's glazing work transformed the window openings from gaping wounds into sources of colored light. As he somehow obtained pieces of stained glass from a demolished church in Houston and incorporated them into geometric patterns that cast rainbow reflections across the chapel's interior walls. Otto's painting was perhaps the most spectacular transformation. Working with limited materials but unlimited creativity, he created a series of small frescoes on the interior walls depicting scenes of natural beauty: rolling hills, flowing rivers, peaceful forests. The images were deliberately non-denominational and non-national, representing the kind of natural beauty that spoke to universal human longing for peace and harmony. Pert's electrical work was purely functional, but no less important. Working with salvaged wire and fixtures, he created a simple but effective lighting system that allowed the chapel to be used for evening services or gatherings. The soft illumination enhanced Otto's painted scenes and created an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. As the project neared completion in late October, Father Richter began to organize plans for a dedication ceremony. The question of who would be invited and who would conduct the service required delicate negotiations between the German prisoners, the American camp administration, and the local community. Colonel Harrington initially hesitated to approve a public ceremony, concerned about potential security issues and community reactions. But the project had generated so much positive attention, and the quality of the restoration work was so impressive that he eventually agreed to a small, carefully controlled celebration. The dedication ceremony took place on a crisp November afternoon, with golden autumn light streaming through the restored stained glass windows. The chapel was filled to capacity with an unlikely congregation: German prisoners of war, American camp personnel, and a handful of local residents who had been touched by the project. Mrs. Crawford was there, of course, sitting in the front pew and clutching a photograph of her late husband. Several other families who had connections to the original chapel had driven in from surrounding towns. A reporter from the Houston Chronicle was present, having heard about the unusual story and convinced his editor that it was worth covering. Father Richter conducted the service in both German and English, with participation from a Methodist minister from the nearby town of Bryan, who had volunteered to help represent the local community. The service was deliberately ecumenical, focusing on themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the human capacity for creation and beauty, even in the midst of conflict and division. But it was the music that provided the most memorable moment of the ceremony. As Father Richter concluded his remarks, the German prisoners began to sing, their voices joining in a hymn that many of the Americans recognized despite the language barrier. When they reached the chorus, several of the American guards began humming along, and then Mrs. Crawford's wavering voice joined in with the English words she remembered from decades of Sunday services. The moment crystallized everything the chapel project had accomplished: a harmony that transcended nationality and recent history, a shared recognition of beauty and hope that had been created through cooperation and brass. Mutual respect. Erich stood at the back of the chapel during the service, overwhelmed by emotions he had thought himself incapable of feeling. For the first time in years, he had been part of creating something, rather than destroying it. He had worked alongside men who had been his enemies, and found them to be decent human beings capable of appreciation and respect. He had taken something broken and made it beautiful again. After the ceremony, as people milled around outside the chapel in the crisp autumn air, Colonel Harrington approached Erich. The two men stood side by side, looking at the restored building that gleamed white against the blue Texas sky. "You kept your word, Bauer," the colonel said quietly. "This turned out better than I ever imagined it could. Thank you for taking the risk, sir, for trusting us with something important. What will you do when you're repatriated? When you go back to Germany?" Erich was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had been weighing on his mind as the war's end brought the reality of return closer. "I'll rebuild," he said finally. "There will be so much to rebuild in Germany. Churches, homes, schools, hospitals. Everything we destroyed will need to be created again. Will you remember this project? Every day, sir. Every building I design, every structure I help create. I'll remember that it's possible for enemies to work together to make something beautiful. I'll remember that people are capable of trust and cooperation, even after terrible things have happened between them." The chapel project officially concluded in early December 1945, as the first waves of prisoner repatriations began. Most of the 12-man work crew would be returning to Germany within the following months, carrying with them memories of an extraordinary experience that had restored not just a building, but something essential in their understanding of human nature. The chapel itself became a fixture in the local community, used for services by several denominations and for community gatherings that brought together people who might otherwise never have found common ground. Mrs. Crawford, before her death 2 years later, arranged for a small plaque to be installed beside the front door, reading simply, "Restored with care by German prisoners of war and their American guards, 1945. A testament to the power of cooperation and faith." Years later, as the former prisoners scattered to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany, several maintained correspondence with American guards who had supervised the project. Klaus Zimmermann, despite his injured arm, became a successful electrical contractor in Hamburg and named his first son William after Colonel Harrington. Johann Weber returned to his carpentry trade in Bavaria and incorporated design elements inspired by the Texas chapel into dozens of reconstruction projects throughout southern Germany. Heinrich Müller used his stonework skills to help rebuild churches destroyed during the bombing of German cities, always insisting on the same meticulous attention to craftsmanship he had learned to appreciate Berber. During the chapel restoration, Father Richter resumed his ministry and spent his remaining years counseling veterans and former prisoners, helping them process the psychological wounds of war and captivity. But it was Erich Bauer who perhaps carried the deepest and most lasting impact from the experience. Returning to Munich in spring 1946, he found a city largely destroyed, its architectural heritage reduced to rubble, and its population struggling to survive in the ruins of what had once been one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Rather than despair at the magnitude of the destruction, Erich threw himself into reconstruction work with the same methodical precision and attention to beauty he had brought to the Texas chapel. He became one of Munich's most respected reconstruction architects, known not just for functional designs, but for buildings that incorporated elements of hope and beauty even when budgets were minimal and materials scarce. In every project, from simple apartment buildings to reconstructed churches, Erich found ways to include small details that elevated the merely functional into something approaching the beautiful. A carefully designed window frame, a thoughtfully proportioned entrance, a small decorative element that caught and reflected light. These became his signatures as he helped rebuild not just structures, but the civic pride and cultural identity of his devastated city. More importantly, Erich carried forward the lessons of cooperation and mutual respect he had learned during his captivity. As reconstruction efforts brought together German workers with American occupation personnel, former enemies who needed to find ways to collaborate on massive rebuilding projects, Erich became known as a bridge builder, someone who could facilitate understanding between groups that had every historical reason to distrust each other. He established relationships with American engineers and architects who were part of the reconstruction effort, sharing technical knowledge and cultural insights that helped projects succeed where they might otherwise have failed due to misunderstanding or miscommunication. These professional relationships, built on the foundation of mutual respect he had learned during the chapel project, evolved into lasting friendships that endured long after the occupation period ended. In 1952, Erich received an unexpected letter from Texas. Colonel Harrington, now retired from the Army and working in private industry, was planning a visit to Europe and hoped to meet with some of the former prisoners who had worked on the chapel project. The reunion, held in Munich's restored city center, brought together men who had shared an extraordinary experience and wanted to understand how it had shaped their subsequent lives. The conversation that took place over several days revealed how deeply the chapel experience had affected all of them. For the Americans, it had demonstrated that their former enemies were complex human beings, capable of beauty, craftsmanship, and moral growth. For the Germans, it had restored faith in the possibility of redemption and cooperation, proving that they could move beyond the destruction and hatred of war towards something constructive and positive. Colonel Harrington brought photographs of the chapel as it existed in 1952, still well-maintained and actively used by the community. The building had weathered Texas storms and summer heat, its restoration work proving as durable as it was beautiful. More significantly, it had become a symbol in the local community of the possibility for reconciliation and cooperation across cultural and national boundaries. The reunion led to ongoing correspondence between the former prisoners and their American guards, relationships that lasted decades and included visits, shared family celebrations, and collaborative business ventures. These personal connections became part of the larger process of reconciliation between Germany and America, individual relationships that helped heal wounds and build trust on a human level. As Erich aged and his career evolved from hands-on reconstruction work to teaching and mentoring younger architects, he made the chapel project a central part of his instruction. Students at the Munich Technical University heard the story regularly, learning not just about construction techniques and project management, but about the importance of understanding that architecture serves human needs that go beyond mere shelter. Building is not just about creating structures, he would tell his students. It's about creating spaces where human beings can become better than they were before. A well-designed building can inspire hope, facilitate community, and remind people of their capacity for beauty and cooperation. The chapel story became legendary among his students, many of whom went on to successful architectural careers and carried forward Erich's philosophy. The buildings should serve not just functional needs, but also the human need for beauty, dignity, and community. Connection. Several of his former students eventually visited the chapel in Texas, making pilgrimages to see the small building that had played such a transformative role in their mentor's life and philosophy. In 1975, 30 years after the chapel's restoration, Erich was invited to return to Texas for a commemorative ceremony marking the anniversary of the project. The event, organized by the local historical society with support from the German-American community, brought together surviving participants from both sides of the original project. Erich flew from Munich to Houston, his first return to American soil since his repatriation. The Texas landscape looked different after 3 decades, more developed and populated. But as his rental car approached the site of the former Camp Hearn, he felt the same mixture of anticipation and emotion that had sustained him through the original chapel project. The camp itself was long gone, converted to agricultural use, and eventually subdivided into residential developments. But the chapel stood exactly where it had always been, its white walls still gleaming in the Texas sun, its stained glass windows casting the same rainbow patterns across the interior that Peter had created with such care all those years ago. Walking through the front door, Erich was overwhelmed by how perfectly preserved everything appeared. The pews Johann had crafted still bore the subtle decorative elements he had carved into the end pieces. Heinrich's limestone altar remained polished and dignified, reflecting the afternoon light with the same gentle glow. Anno's painted frescoes had faded slightly, but retained their power to evoke feelings of peace and natural beauty. Most remarkably, the chapel was clearly still in active use. Fresh flowers adorned the altar, hymnals were arranged neatly in the pews, and a small guest book near the entrance contained entries from visitors representing dozens of nationalities and religious denominations. The building had become what Father Richter had envisioned during those planning sessions back in the prisoner of war camp, a sacred space that transcended the boundaries of any single faith tradition or cultural identity. The commemorative ceremony drew more than 200 attendees, including several children and grandchildren of the original participants. Colonel Harrington, now 73 years old but still erect and dignified, served as the master of ceremonies. Klaus Zimmermann had flown in from Hamburg, his injured arm now completely stiff, but his enthusiasm for the reunion undiminished. Johann Weber arrived from Bavaria with his adult son, who had become a carpenter himself and wanted to see the work that had so profoundly influenced his father's approach to craftsmanship. Father Richter had died 5 years earlier, but his successor in the Munich parish where he had served sent a letter that was read during the ceremony, describing the profound impact the chapel experience had continued to have on the former chaplain's ministry and his understanding of God's capacity to bring good out of even the most difficult circumstances. The ceremony included presentations from local historians who had researched the chapel's role in the community during the 3 decades since its restoration. The building had hosted more than 1,500 wedding ceremonies, countless baptisms and funeral services, community meetings during natural disasters, and regular worship services for multiple WWII denominations. It had become, in the words of one local resident, the heart of our community's spiritual life. But perhaps the most moving element of the ceremony was the music. Just as during the original dedication 30 years earlier, the gathered crowd joined voices in hymns that transcended language barriers. Sons and daughters of the original participants sang alongside their parents, creating generational harmony that seemed to symbolize the lasting peace that had grown out of wartime cooperation. During his remarks to the assembled crowd, Erich reflected on the lessons he had carried forward from the chapel project and how they had shaped not just his professional work, but his understanding of human nature and possibility. 30 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the restored chapel, we were enemies who had spent years trying to destroy each other and everything the other side valued. But when we came together with tools and materials and a shared commitment to creating something beautiful, we discovered that the things that unite human beings are stronger than the things that divide us. He paused, looking around at faces that included former prisoners, former guards, children, grandchildren, and community members who had been touched by the chapel's presence over the decades. This building taught us that it's possible to move beyond hatred and destruction toward cooperation and beauty. Every church I helped rebuild in Germany, every home and school and hospital. I approached with the memory of this place and the knowledge that even former enemies can work together to create something that serves the highest aspirations of human community. After the ceremony, Erich spent several additional days in Texas, visiting with the families of participants and touring other restoration projects that had been inspired by the chapel's example. He learned that the cooperation model developed during the prisoner of war project had influenced post-war reconstruction efforts in multiple communities. As American personnel returning from Europe brought with them new appreciation for the possibilities of international collaboration, the visit also provided an opportunity for Erich to see how the chapel had evolved to serve contemporary community needs while maintaining its essential character and spiritual purpose. A small addition had been constructed in the 1960s to provide space for community meetings and social gatherings, but it had been designed to complement rather than compete with the original structure. The same attention to craftsmanship and beauty that had characterized the original restoration was evident in every detail of the addition. More significantly, the chapel had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in stories of reconciliation and international cooperation. The guest book contained entries from visitors representing dozens of countries, many of whom had come specifically to see the place where former enemies had worked together to create something beautiful during one of history's most divisive conflicts. Several entries were from German tourists who had heard family stories about relatives who had been prisoners of war in America and wanted to understand what that experience had been like. Others were from American veterans or their families, seeking to understand different perspectives on the war and its aftermath. Still others were from people dealing with contemporary conflicts who hoped to find inspiration for their own efforts at peace-building and reconciliation. Returning to Germany after the commemorative visit, Erich found himself energized by the experience and determined to document the chapel story more comprehensively for future generations. He began working on a detailed memoir that would preserve not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotional and spiritual transformation that had occurred for all the participants. The memoir project became a collaborative effort, as Erich reached out to other survivors of the chapel project to gather their memories and perspectives. Letters flew back and forth between Germany and America, between former prisoners and former guards, as the participants worked together to create a comprehensive record of their shared experience. Klaus contributed technical details about the electrical work and his memories of how the project had helped him adapt to his war injury by finding new ways to contribute meaningfully to group efforts. Johann provided detailed sketches of the carpentry work and reflected on how the experience had influenced his approach to craftsmanship throughout his post-war career. Heinrich wrote extensively about the stonework and the satisfaction he had found in creating something permanent and beautiful after years of military service that had been focused on temporary tactical objectives. Otto described his painting techniques and how the opportunity to create artistic beauty had rekindled his interest in art, leading to a successful post-war career as an illustrator and commercial artist. The American participants contributed their own perspectives, describing how the chapel project had changed their understanding of their former enemies and influenced their approach to post-war reconstruction. Efforts in Germany and Japan. Colonel Harrington provided official documents and correspondence that revealed the administrative challenges he had faced in approving and supporting such an unprecedented project. The completed memoir, published in both German and English editions in 1978, became a significant contribution to the historical record of prisoner of war experiences during World War II. But more than a historical document, it served as a testament to the human capacity for transformation and cooperation even under the most challenging circumstances. The book's publication led to speaking engagements and academic conferences where Erich shared the chapel story with audiences ranging from military personnel to religious leaders to international development workers. The core message remained consistent across all these presentations: that it's possible to move beyond conflict toward cooperation, that former enemies can become collaborators in creating beauty and meaning, and that individual acts of trust and generosity can have impacts that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. As Erich entered his 70s, he began to see the chapel experience as the defining event of his life, the moment when he discovered that his fundamental identity was not as a soldier or even as a German, but as a human being capable of creating beauty and fostering cooperation across cultural and national boundaries. This understanding influenced not just his professional work, but his personal relationships, his parenting philosophy, and his approach to community engagement. His children grew up hearing the chapel story and understanding it as a fundamental family value that emphasized the importance of building bridges rather than walls, of seeking common ground rather than emphasizing differences, and of approaching even difficult relationships with the assumption that cooperation and mutual respect were possible if one was willing to take the first step toward trust. Several of Erich's children went on to careers in international development, diplomacy, and cross-cultural education, carrying forward the lessons of the Chapel Project into new contexts and challenges. His daughter Maria became a UNESCO educator, specializing in post-conflict reconstruction programs, while his son Hans worked for the German Foreign Ministry, focusing on reconciliation programs in regions recovering from ethnic or national conflicts. The chapel story became part of the family heritage, told and retold at family gatherings, and passed down to grandchildren who understood it as both a historical event and a moral instruction about the kind of people they should strive to become. The emphasis was not on the specific details of construction techniques or camp administration, but on the underlying principles of respect, cooperation, and the human capacity for transformation. In 1985, 40 years after the chapel's restoration, Erich made his final visit to Texas. At 82 years old and in declining health, he wanted to see the building one more time and to participate in a final ceremony that would formally establish the chapel as a historic landmark and peace memorial. The designation ceremony drew international attention, with representatives from the German government, American veterans organizations, religious leaders from multiple denominations, and peace activists from around the world. The chapel had evolved from a local restoration project into a symbol recognized internationally as representing the possibilities for reconciliation and cooperation, even in the aftermath of devastating conflict. During this final visit, Erich was struck by how the chapel had continued to evolve while maintaining its essential character and purpose. A small museum had been established in the adjacent community center, displaying photographs, documents, and artifacts from the original restoration project, alongside contemporary materials about international peace-building efforts that had drawn inspiration from the chapel story. Most significantly, the chapel had become the centerpiece of an annual international conference on reconciliation and peace-building, drawing participants from conflict zones around the world to share strategies and experiences in moving beyond hatred and destruction toward cooperation and mutual understanding. The conference format deliberately echoed the chapel project's emphasis on practical collaboration rather than abstract theorizing. Participants worked together on community service projects during the day and gathered in the chapel each evening for reflection and discussion about their experiences. The combination of physical work and spiritual reflection that had proved so transformative for the original participants continued to produce powerful results for contemporary peacebuilders. Erich's final speech, delivered in the chapel to an audience that included diplomats, religious leaders, former adversaries from multiple conflicts, and local community members whose families had been touched by the chapel's presence, summarized the lessons he had learned and carried forward over 4 decades. "This building represents a simple but profound truth," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "When people come together with shared commitment to creating something beautiful and meaningful, the barriers that seem to divide them, even barriers created by years of conflict and hatred, can be overcome." He gestured toward the restored interior, still glowing in the afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows. "We built this with hammer and nails, with stone and wood and paint. But what we really built was trust. What we really created was the knowledge that former enemies can become collaborators in service of something larger than their individual interests or national identities." The speech concluded with a challenge to the international audience. Go home and build something beautiful with someone you have considered your enemy. Start small, start simple, but start. You will be amazed at what becomes possible when people discover their shared capacity for creation, rather than destruction. 3 months after returning to Germany from this final Texas visit, Erich Bauer died peacefully in his sleep. His funeral in Munich drew hundreds of mourners, including former prisoners of war, American veterans, students and colleagues from his architectural career, and family members representing 3 generations. The service was held in one of the churches he had helped rebuild after the war, its beauty and dignity serving as a testament to his life's work. But the final memorial service took place in Texas, in the chapel that had played such a transformative role in Erich's understanding of human possibility. The service, attended by many of the same people who had participated in the 40th anniversary ceremony just months earlier, celebrated not just Erich's life, but the ongoing legacy of the chapel project. Colonel Harrington, now 92, and one of the last surviving original participants, delivered the eulogy. His remarks focused not on military service or professional accomplishments, but on the courage Erich had shown in proposing the chapel project and the leadership he had demonstrated in showing how former enemies could work together toward common goals. Erich taught us that peace is not just the absence of conflict, Harrington said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel that had been the centerpiece of both men's most meaningful collaboration. Peace is the active presence of cooperation, respect, and shared commitment to creating something beautiful together. This building stands as proof that such peace is possible, even between people who have every reason to mistrust each other. The chapel continues to serve its community and to draw visitors from around the world who come to see the place where German prisoners of war and American guards worked together to create something beautiful during one of history's most divisive conflicts. The building itself remains much as Erich and his colleagues left it, a testament to both their craftsmanship and their vision of what becomes possible when people choose cooperation over conflict. The annual Reconciliation Conference continues to meet in the chapel, drawing participants from contemporary conflict zones who come seeking practical strategies for moving beyond hatred toward mutual understanding and collaboration. The format established by the original chapel project, combining physical work with spiritual reflection and emphasizing practical cooperation over abstract theorizing, continues to produce remarkable results. The museum adjacent to the chapel has expanded to include exhibits about reconciliation efforts around the world, many of which have drawn direct inspiration from the chapel story. Visitors can see correspondence between Erich and peace builders working in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, the Balkans, and other regions where former enemies have found ways to work together toward common goals. But perhaps the most important legacy of the chapel project is not preserved in any museum or documented in any historical record. It lives in the thousands of individuals who have heard the story and been inspired to seek cooperation rather than conflict in their own relationships and communities. It continues in the architects and engineers who approach their work with Erich's understanding that buildings should serve not just functional needs, but also the human need for beauty and dignity. It persists in the diplomats and peace builders who remember that even the most intractable conflicts can be transformed when people discover their shared capacity for creation. The small white chapel in the Texas countryside stands as more than a restored building. It represents proof that the human capacity for beauty, cooperation, and mutual respect is stronger than the forces that seem to divide us. It reminds everyone who enters that former enemies can become collaborators in creating something beautiful, and that individual acts of trust and generosity can have impacts that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. In the end, the chapel project accomplished something that military victory alone could never achieve. It demonstrated that peace is not just possible but sustainable when it grows out of shared work toward common goals. It proved that beauty and dignity can emerge even from the most difficult circumstances when people choose cooperation over conflict, creation over destruction, and hope over despair. The hammers that rang out across the Texas plains in 1945 continue to echo in every nail driven by someone choosing to build rather than tear down. In every bridge extended across seemingly impossible divisions, in every moment when someone discovers that their former enemy can become their partner in creating something beautiful. The legacy of the chapel project extended far beyond the individuals who participated directly in its construction. As word of the story spread through academic circles, military institutions, and religious communities. It began to influence approaches to conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction in ways that none of the original participants could have anticipated. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a conflict resolution specialist at the University of Texas, first encountered the Chape story while researching her doctoral dissertation on prisoner of war experiences during CI. World War II. Initially attracted by the unusual nature of the project, she found herself increasingly fascinated by the psychological and social dynamics that had made such cooperation possible between former and enemies. Her research revealed that the Chape project represented a nearly unique example of successful collaboration between captors and prisoners, one that had produced lasting positive effects for all participants. Most prisoner of war experiences, even those conducted according to international conventions, were characterized by mutual suspicion, minimal interaction, and psychological effects that persisted long brass. After repatriation, the Chape project stood out as a remarkable exception that demanded deeper analysis. Dr. Martinez spent 3 years conducting extensive interviews with surviving participants and their families, analyzing camp records and correspondence, and studying the broader historical context that had made the project possible. Her resulting book, Building Bridges, Lessons in Reconciliation from a Texas Chapel, became a foundational text in the emerging field of peace-building and conflict transformation. The book's impact extended beyond academic circles to influence practical approaches to post-conflict reconstruction in regions around the world. International development organizations began incorporating elements of the Chape model into their programs, emphasizing collaborative physical projects that brought former adversaries together and shared creative work. In Rwanda, a decade after the genocide, community leaders used principles derived from the Chape story to organize joint construction projects where Hutu and Tutsi survivors worked together to build schools and community centers. The physical work provided a concrete focus for cooperation, while creating spaces that would serve the broader community's needs for healing and reconciliation. Similar programs emerged in the Balkans, where Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian communities used collaborative restoration projects to begin rebuilding trust and social connections that had been shattered by ethnic conflict. The emphasis on creating something beautiful and permanent, rather than simply addressing immediate survival needs, proved particularly effective in helping participants move beyond trauma toward hope for the future. The Chape model's influence extended even to corporate environments, where managers dealing with merger-related conflicts or international joint ventures began using collaborative projects to build trust and cooperation between groups with historically adversarial relationships. The emphasis on shared physical work toward a common creative goal proved remarkably effective in breaking down barriers and establishing productive working relationships. Meanwhile, the chapel itself continued to evolve as both a functional community space and a pilgrimage destination for people seeking inspiration for their own peace-building efforts. The annual Reconciliation Conference grew from a small gathering of academics and activists to an international event that drew hundreds of participants from around the world. The conference format continued to emphasize the combination of practical work and reflective discussion that had characterized the original Chape project. Each year, conference participants spent their mornings working on community service projects in the surrounding area, from habitat restoration to building maintenance to educational program development. Afternoons were devoted to workshops and presentations, where participants shared experiences and strategies from their own peace-building work. But it was the evening sessions in the chapel itself that provided the most transformative experiences for many participants. Sitting in the space that had been created through collaboration between former enemies, surrounded by the physical evidence of what becomes possible when people choose cooperation over conflict, participants found themselves able to envision possibilities for their own situations that had previously seemed impossible. Maria Santos, a community organizer from Colombia who had lost family members to both government forces and rebel groups during her country's decades-long internal conflict, attended the conference in 2005. Her initial skepticism about the relevance of a World War II prisoner of war story to contemporary Latin American conflicts began to dissolve as she participated in the week-long program. At first, I thought this was just another academic exercise, she recalled years later. Americans and Germans working together after their war seemed like it had nothing to do with the situation in my country, where the conflicts were so much more complex and had gone on for so much longer. But the combination of morning work projects and evening reflection sessions gradually opened her perspective to new possibilities. Working alongside former adversaries from other conflicts, Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants, Israeli and Palestinian activists, South African apartheid survivors, both black and white, she began to see common patterns in how people moved beyond hatred toward cooperation. The physical work was crucial, she explained. When you're hammering nails, or mixing concrete, or painting walls alongside someone, you can't maintain the same level of abstract hatred that's possible when you only encounter them as a representative of the group you're fighting against. You see their hands getting dirty, you hear them grunt when they lift something heavy. You notice when they're careful not to splash paint on their clothes. They become human in ways that make it harder to see them as pure enemy. Maria returned to Colombia with new ideas about how to approach peace building in her own community. Instead of focusing primarily on dialogue and negotiation, she began organizing collaborative work projects that brought together community members from different sides of the conflict to address shared practical needs. The first project was Monist, a community garden in a neighborhood that had been particularly hard hit by violence. Former government supporters and rebel sympathizers worked together to clear land, build raised beds, and plant vegetables that would provide food for families struggling with economic hardship caused by the ongoing conflict. The success of the garden project led to additional collaborations, including renovation of a community center, construction of a playground for local children, and development of a small-scale water treatment system that improved sanitation for the entire neighborhood. Each project brought together people who had previously viewed each other as enemies, creating opportunities for personal relationships that gradually began to heal the deeper community divisions. The Colombia projects, directly inspired by the Chape story, became a model for similar efforts throughout Latin America. The Inter-American Development Bank began funding community reconstruction programs that emphasized collaborative physical projects, recognizing their effectiveness in building social cohesion and trust in post-conflict environments. Back in Texas, the Chapel's role as an inspiration for international peace-building efforts brought increasing attention and support from unexpected quarters. The German government established a small endowment to help maintain the building and support the annual conference, recognizing the chapel as an important symbol of successful German-American reconciliation. The American military, initially skeptical of the attention being paid to a project that seemed to glorify cooperation with enemy prisoners, gradually came to see the Chapel story as an example of American values and leadership in promoting international understanding. Military academies began including the story in their curricula on leadership and post-conflict operations, using it to illustrate the importance of treating adversaries with dignity and recognizing opportunities for constructive engagement. Religious organizations from multiple denominations also embraced the chapel as a symbol of faith's power to transcend national and cultural boundaries. The building hosted interfaith services and conferences that brought together Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist leaders to discuss common approaches to peace building and social justice. These religious gatherings often proved particularly powerful because they took place in a space that had been created through interfaith cooperation, even though the original participants had not consciously set out to create an interfaith symbol. Father Richter's inclusive approach to the dedication ceremony had established a precedent for religious diversity that continued to characterize the chapel's spiritual life. Rabbi David Goldstein, who participated in several interfaith conferences at the chapel, observed that the building's history made it uniquely suitable for bringing together people from different religious traditions. When you're sitting in a space that was created by Catholic, Protestant, and secular prisoners working together with guards from various faith backgrounds, all focused on creating something beautiful rather than promoting any particular theological position, it becomes easier to focus on shared values rather than doctrinal differences. End quote. The interfaith dimension of the chapel's ongoing mission led to the development of educational programs that brought together seminary students from different religious traditions to study approaches to reconciliation and peace-building. These programs combined theoretical study with practical experience. As participants worked together on community service projects while engaging in intensive dialogue about their different theological perspectives on forgiveness, justice, and social responsibility. One particularly successful program paired American seminary students with their counterparts from institutions in Germany, creating opportunities for young religious leaders to explore the historical relationship between their countries while working together on contemporary challenges. Many of these partnerships continued long after the formal program ended, creating ongoing relationships that strengthened international religious cooperation. The educational impact of the chapel story extended beyond religious institutions to influence approaches to teaching history and social studies in schools around the world. Teachers discovered that the story provided a powerful way to help students understand that historical conflicts involve real human beings capable of growth and change, rather than abstract forces or inevitable cultural clashes. High school students who studied the chapel project often expressed surprise at learning that enemy soldiers could work together cooperatively and develop mutual respect. Many had been exposed primarily to war narratives that emphasized heroism and victory, with little attention to the complex human relationships that emerge in post-conflict situations. Sarah Johnson, a high school history teacher in Michigan, began using the chapel story as a centerpiece for a unit on World War II and its aftermath. She found that her students responded more positively to this narrative of cooperation and reconstruction than to traditional approaches that focused primarily on military campaigns and political decisions. The students could relate to the idea of having to work with someone they didn't like or trust, she explained. Most of them had experience with group projects where they had to collaborate with classmates they had conflicts with, so they could understand the dynamics involved in the chapel project, even though the historical context was completely different. End quote. The educational applications of the chapel story led to the development of curriculum materials that help teachers around the world incorporate peace-building concepts into their history and social studies classes. These materials emphasized critical thinking about conflict resolution, empathy for people in difficult situations, and understanding of how individual choices can contribute to larger social transformation. The chapel's influence on educational approaches extended to higher education as well, where the story became a case study in business schools, international relations programs, and public policy courses. NBA students analyzed the project management and leadership challenges that Colonel Harrington had faced in approving and overseeing such an unprecedented initiative. International relations students examined the diplomatic implications of cooperative projects between former adversaries. Public policy students explored how government institutions could create space for innovative approaches to social problems. These academic applications helped ensure that lessons from the chapel project continued to reach new generations of leaders who would face their own challenges in managing conflicts and building cooperation across cultural and national boundaries. The emphasis on practical collaboration rather than theoretical discussion resonated particularly strongly with students who were preparing for careers in international business, diplomacy, and public service. As the 21st century progressed, the chapel faced new challenges related to maintenance, funding, and relevance to contemporary conflicts that seemed increasingly complex and intractable compared to the relatively clear-cut national conflicts of the World War II era. Some critics argued that the chapel story, while inspiring, had limited applicability to conflicts involving terrorism, ethnic cleansing, or failed states where traditional diplomatic and military approaches had proven ineffective. These critiques led to deeper examination of what elements of the chapel model could be adapted to contemporary challenges, and which aspects were specific to the historical context of prisoner of war camps. Post-World War II reconstruction. Researchers and practitioners began developing modified approaches that maintained the core principles of collaborative physical work and shared creative goals while adapting to different cultural contexts and conflict dynamics. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American military personnel who had studied the chapel story began experimenting with reconstruction projects that emphasized collaboration with local communities rather than simply providing assistance or grant. Imposing external solutions. These efforts had mixed results, but they demonstrated the continued relevance of the basic insight that shared physical work could build trust and cooperation even in highly polarized environments. The chapel's board of directors, established in the 1990s to oversee the building's maintenance and programming, recognized the need to address questions about contemporary relevance while preserving the essential character and mission that had made the building significant. They commissioned a comprehensive study of how the chapel model had been adapted in different contexts around the world, seeking to understand which elements were most transferable and effective. The study, completed in 2010, revealed that successful adaptations of the chapel model shared several common characteristics. They involved collaborative physical work toward a shared creative goal. They brought together people who had reasons to mistrust each other, but were willing to engage in limited cooperation. They emphasized practical results rather than abstract dialogue or negotiation. They created something permanent and beautiful that would serve the broader community's needs. And they were led by individuals who were willing to take personal risks to make cooperation possible. These findings led to the development of a more systematic approach to applying chapel model principles in different contexts. International development organizations, conflict resolution specialists, and community organizers began using structured methodologies that incorporated these elements while adapting to local cultural norms, resource constraints, and specific conflict dynamics. The chapel itself benefited from this systematic analysis, as it helped clarify the building's unique role as both a historical landmark and an ongoing laboratory for peace-building innovation. The annual conference evolved to include more structured opportunities for participants to develop and test new applications of collaborative project approaches to their own conflict situations. By 2015, 70 years after the original restoration project, the chapel had become the centerpiece of an international network of peace-building practitioners, researchers, and educators who continue to draw inspiration from Erich Bauer's original vision of former enemies working together to create something beautiful. The building itself remained much as the German prisoners and American guards had left it, but its influence had spread far beyond the Texas countryside where it sat. The enduring power of the chapel story lay not in any single dramatic moment or heroic individual action, but in the quiet demonstration that ordinary people, given the right circumstances and leadership, could choose cooperation over conflict, creation over destruction, and hope over despair. In a world that often seemed dominated by division and hatred, the small white building continued to stand as proof that a different kind of future was always possible for those with the courage to build it together. The chapel stands as permanent proof that such transformation is not just possible, but inevitable when people have the courage to trust in their shared humanity.